Can you record people without their permission? Well, it depends. But be very careful, because in many states like Washington State, recording someone without their permission is actually illegal. But there are a bunch of exceptions to that law. So in this video, I'm going to go over when you can record someone without their permission and when it's against the law. So stick around. Now, nothing in this video is legal advice. This is just legal information. Talk to a lawyer about your specific situation in order to get legal advice. Many states, including Washington State, where I'm licensed to practice, have what are called two-party consent laws. Two-party consent laws require that when you record a conversation with another person, that other person in the conversation is aware of the recording and also consents to that recording. Now, this isn't a law in every state. Many states do not have two-party consent laws. So here's a list of states with two-party consent laws. And since I'm licensed in Washington State, I will specifically be talking about Washington State's two-party consent law. So what does this law actually mean? The law means that if you were having a private conversation with someone and you were secretly recording that conversation with, say, your voice recorder on your phone, for instance, you might be violating the law. And I see this happen a lot as an employment lawyer. Many of my clients think it would be helpful for their case to secretly record conversations with their managers or coworkers to use as evidence, only to find out later that they were actually breaking the law. And when the defendant finds out that you broke the law, they make a big deal about that. But it doesn't always have to be a big deal, because there are a bunch of exceptions to the law. So let's go over those exceptions now. There are a bunch of situations where your recording does not violate the law. So here are some of those situations. 1. When the other party has threatened you or made unlawful requests. 2. When the conversation is a public conversation. And 3. When you obtain consent by announcement. So let's go over each. The first big exception to the two-party consent rule occurs when the other party threatens you or makes unlawful requests or demands. In those circumstances, you do not have to get the other party's consent to record them. So, if the party being recorded made some threats or demanded something unlawful like subjecting you to sexual harassment, then you do not need their consent to record them. And threats can be implied from other circumstances, too. For instance, in one case, Thrasher v. Thrasher, a wife secretly recorded a conversation with her husband after he sent her threatening texts. And even though the husband didn't make any explicit threats in the recorded conversation, the evidence of his previous threats was enough for the court to conclude that the wife's secret recording was totally okay. I'll put a link to that case in the description below in case you're curious. But similar circumstances can happen in employment cases. Say, for instance, you were secretly recording someone who had previously sexually harassed you. Well, if you have evidence of their previous unlawful requests, then you have good reason to record the conversation without their consent. And it probably does not violate the two-party consent law. The next exception to the two-party consent law is public conversations. Generally, people do not have privacy interests in public spaces. That's one of the reasons why it's generally okay to record police officers when you're in public, or why it's okay for paparazzi to take pictures and record celebrities when they're walking to their car. So, if you were recording a conversation in a public space with other people around, it's probably not a violation of the two-party consent law, even if you don't have their consent. Finally, as the name of the law implies, it requires consent from both parties in order for the recording to be lawful. So if the other party consents to you recording the conversation, then it's totally okay for you to record that conversation, obviously. But the law doesn't actually require the other party to say, "I consent to this recording." The law defines consent as follows. Consent shall be considered obtained whenever one party has announced to all other parties engaged in the communication or conversation that such communication or conversation is about to be recorded. So if you just announce that you were recording the conversation, that works too, as long as your announcement is also recorded. So what happens if you record someone without their consent and none of the exceptions apply? How much trouble are you actually in? Well, the consequences of violating this law can actually be serious. The law states that violators of this law are guilty of a gross misdemeanor, which is not something to take lightly. Furthermore, if your employer finds out about you illegally recording them or someone else in the organization, that would certainly be reason enough to terminate your employment. And keep in mind that if you were involved in a civil legal matter, like a lawsuit against your employer, at some point you will probably have to turn this recording over to the defendant as part of the discovery process. So they're going to find out about it. And when they do, they're going to make a big deal about it. With that said, however, I have to also say that I've never seen anyone actually get prosecuted for recording a private conversation. If you suspect your employer is terminating you for an illegal reason and you secretly record the conversation, I find it hard to believe that a prosecutor would actually pursue charging you for that crime. But it's not impossible. The bottom line is that you have to be careful when recording others without their consent. Many states prohibit recording private conversations without the consent of all parties in the conversation. However, if you are recording someone who threatened you, or you're in public, or you announce that you were recording the conversation, then you probably don't need consent from all the parties. Okay, that's all for me this week. Like and share this video, it helps other workers find it. The more we hold employers accountable for their wrongdoing, the more we protect other workers. See you next time.